if you've read any of the network books, you have read about REAMP. I picked up this Impact Networks this morning and looked in the index, and there's like 10 pages just about REAMP, and 4 pages just kind of on their story under evolving purpose and principles, which was kind of the frame for our talk today about their evolution over 20 years and how they've changed and grown. And of those 20 years, Sarah has been with them almost 14, right? So she is
Yeah, it'll be my 15th annual meeting this year. Cool.
Woo!
How'd that happen?
So, yeah, time's flying. So, as the director of community management, she's responsible for fostering a healthy ecosystem within the network, including managing the network's membership services and facilitating connections in the network. And we met her in 2020 when they put out an RFP during the pandemic to shift their annual meeting to virtual. So we wrote a proposal to help them, and they chose us. And we're going to be working with them on their annual meeting now for the third time,
Yeah.
fourth time
Yeah,
this year.
20,
Yeah.
21, 22, 23. Yeah.
And I've learned so much just working with them on their annual meeting. They're an incredible group. They have a team of 5. You have 5 FTEs now?
We do know.
Yep, 5 FTEs. And we're wearing our reamp shirts today, which they send out. They sent us in the mail, and Sarah does such an awesome job with her sending out these amazing care packages to their members that everybody in the network loves, including us. Thanks for learning. Bart, you want to talk about the pagoda also? I love that place. Good morning, Bianca. Wonderful to see you. Bianca joins us from Virginia. She has somehow 3 amazing part-time jobs that all sound like they could be full-time jobs, doing environmental literacy work, participatory grant making work, all kinds of incredible stuff. So this is a great group doing incredible work across the region, and we're so happy you're here. So we are so pleased to call Sarah a colleague and a friend, and we're just so happy that the planets have aligned for her to be with us today.
Well, thank you. That was a very nice introduction. We've definitely enjoyed our partnership working with Local Concepts. Very collaborative. I feel like they really kind of understand our network and what we're trying to do, and they just have a lot of patience and willingness to try different things, which I think is a recipe for success in any network. It's really interesting to come in here and talk about REAMP. As Sonia said, there's a lot of literature out there about us, but we've never actually done a really great job of telling our own story. People love telling our story for us. So this training was actually a good reminder of how to tell our own story. And honestly, it was kind of fun to kind of dive back into some of our old materials and just kind of look at things and reminisce a little bit. Um, in thinking about the stories that I wanted to share today, it was really hard to decide what to share. My understanding is that you all are a pretty diverse group of folks yourselves. Some of you are in different places in terms of your network development. So I'm just going to try to touch on some of the big highlights for today. And I'm going to leave lots of time for conversation at the end of this, because I'm sure it's going to just generate a lot of questions, and I'd rather have a conversation than maybe sit here and talk the entire time. Speaking of talking the entire time, one of the things that I would like to do here before I launch into some of my comments is I did want to give you all a chance to get to know each other too a little bit better. So I wanted to throw you into just a breakout room for just maybe 2 minutes or so, just to introduce yourself to somebody else who's here on the line today. So, go ahead and share your name and who you're with and where you're calling in from. And maybe just share what you're bringing in the room today. How are you feeling? What are you bringing in? What's on your mind? This is a chance to kind of get all that off of your chest. And you're going to come back into these pairs later on today as well. So it's a chance to get to know a buddy here in your group. So, Sonia, do you want to set up those breakouts? Just 2 minutes, I'm thinking, is good, long enough. All right, great. And do we have everybody back now, Sonia? Awesome. Cool. Well, welcome back, folks. If you would feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody in the group in the chat. Um, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I think I just have a couple of slides I'll show you. But Christy, if you want to launch the slide deck, we can kind of get started. But, as Sonia said, I'm Director of Community Management for the REAMP Network. And I have been around for a long time, but I wasn't always the Director of Community Management for REAMP. In fact, my early years, I spent just really working with a small segment of members who at that time were doing direct greenhouse gas regulation work. And I was actually only part-time for REAMP up until about 2016 when I came on central staff. So I also bring in this perspective of kind of having grown up professionally in a network. So for those of you who may be like network practitioners yourselves, when we have time for discussion, you're welcome to pick my brain about anything I've learned in that realm as well. But if you don't know who REAMP is, we are a network of nonprofits working here in the upper Midwest. We have about 130 member organizations. That includes philanthropic and advocacy organizations, all thinking systemically and acting collaboratively so that we can equitably eliminate greenhouse gas emissions here in the Midwest by 2050. So this North Star goal that we have, this is the thing that binds us all together in REAMP. Every member organization agrees to this goal as becoming part of the network. But this wasn't always our goal. Actually, our first goal was, you'll see, it was a very policy goal. And this reflection of our values around working equitably wasn't reflected in our goal until about 2018, 2019. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm really going to kind of focus on REAMP's early years because I know this is like a two-part conversation. So I'm really going to kind of focus on like how we got started, what were some of our growing pains, and kind of building up to this like big shift that we had around like this I would say between like the 2016 and 2018 timeframe. And when we get to part 2 next time, we're going to kind of focus more on like that growth and development from REAMP from there on out. But we can go over to the next slide because I want to talk about how REAMP got started. This is a story I actually love telling. We tell this as part of our orientation process as well, because the launch of REAMP, I think, really defined who we are and why who we are today. So when REAMP started, it was actually the Garfield Foundation who had this idea of like having a network focused on climate change, and really breaking down hierarchical relationships between advocates and funders. That was like their two hypotheses. Okay, they're like, look, we think if we're going to make big impactful change, we have to take this like systems thinking approach that nobody else has really done before, and we really have to break down the hierarchical relationships that have existed between advocates and funders. Okay, so that was their hypothesis. Garfield kind of surveyed the U.S. They ended up doing it here in the Midwest for a few reasons. There was a lot of people that were interested in working on this. There's a need to reduce emissions here. We're really heavy on manufacturing and oil and gas production, and there's this political opportunity here in the Midwest as well. So in 2004, what they did is they convened the first 20 network members. And what these poor folks did was set out on a year-long systems mapping process. And I say that because if any of you have any experience with systems mapping, you know this. It's a really challenging process. And for these folks who were walking into the room in 2004, it was their first time doing such a thing. So it took them a year to get all this information out in front of them and figure out how it relates to one another. What you see here is kind of a simplified, a cleaned up version of that original map. But this is what it led to. It led to some really important insights about change that needed to happen and levers that needed to be pulled in the system simultaneously. That was actually really important because for some people walking into that room in 2004, they were like, look, we got to focus on building out the clean energy system, right? We can build out clean energy. We're going to make those products cheaper. Markets are going to shift in favor of clean energy. And then we're going to be able to enact all the rest of the climate solutions we need. But by the time that they were done with the mapping process, they stepped back and they were like, wow, it is just as important that we don't let a new coal plant get built in this region as it is that we continue to build out the clean energy system. So this initial mapping process actually helped bring people into this space where they had a shared understanding of what it is that we're trying to do together, right? They could really see it together. And they started to align and collaborate then around these key nodes that we saw. Yep. So these nodes actually gave birth to our first forms of collaboration that we supported here in REAMP. It actually helped us identify our structure and kind of launch a structure for the network. It also brought people into alignment around our first North Star goal, which was to think systemically and act, or I'm sorry, which was an 80% reduction in the electricity sector by 2030, 80% economy wide by 2050. So that was our first North Star goal, right? That was kind of like our guiding light back there in 2004. And then finally, this mapping process actually gave birth to our name and to the motto that I was seeing in the chat pop up as something people love. Um, this RAMP doesn't stand for anything today, but in 2004, it was the Renewable Energy Alignment Mapping Project. And our logo is actually a derivative of this original systems map. The two black arrows driving down, stopping the coal rush, shutting down the dirty plants. The two green arrows driving up, increasing energy efficiency and clean energy. The bullseye where they intersect represented the North Star goal. So again, like this for us, this launch, like this mapping process, it gave us that shared understanding. We had a shared ground that we were standing on. It helped us see like what we wanted to work towards, right? What is our guiding light? And how are we even going to talk about ourselves, to other people here in the world? So why don't we go over to the next slide? Because what happened then, right? So we had this mapping process, this all happened, and what we did is we got the network started. And we actually launched with 3 working groups initially. So the 2 goals around coal were combined into one we called the working groups at the time. And then we also had a clean energy working group and an energy efficiency working group. And at this time, too, we really kind of wanted to embrace some of these values around network structure. We really wanted to promote like a linear leadership, right? So, in order to decide like who's going to kind of help lead the members within each of these groups, we decided that we were going to have democratically elected working group leaders. And these working group leaders would be supported with money so they could lead the group of members doing work within each of those nodes. There would be enough money for them to do things like, convene members together and hire what we called at the time a part-time associate. Um, these were probably the folks like, they were the more on the ground type of staff, who did some of the administrative duties, some of the organizing type of duties, a little bit of everything. These paid working group leaders also had a seat at our decision-making table. So we had also created what we called a steering committee, kind of like a board of directors. The steering committee was comprised of these elected working group leaders, funders who were putting money into the network, and then together they may make some appointed seats as well, maybe because they wanted to have, maybe a person of color on the board, or they wanted, young representation, something like that. They may make decisions about what that sort of looked like. And let's go over to the next slide. But, the network grew really, really quickly at first. So, as we kind of started, I know this is, you're like, wow, Sarah, thanks for all the acronyms. We love them. But if I would have put all the words up here, it would have been like way too long and heady. But in the middle, we have the steering committee, right? So that was like our board of directors right there. And the steering committee was made up of funders and working group leaders. I don't have it on the slide, but like I said, they may make some appointments. The working group associates, the WGAs, they answered to the working group leaders, but they didn't really answer to anybody else in the network, maybe the members of their working group. Again, the members were electing the working group leaders. Those working group leaders sat on the steering committee. And then we also had this thing called the Global Warming Strategic Action Fund. Oh, what a mouthful, right? So we'll just call that Action Fund for short. But the Global Warming Strategic Action Fund was a committee that we had that was made up of advocates and funders who were making decisions about how to send out grant dollars. Working group leaders had a seat on that table. Funders who were putting money into the network were also sitting at that table. Off to the left-hand side, those were a couple of our initial working groups that we had, right, that members were plugging into. And over time, as REAMP grew, we were, you can go ahead and click on the animation. We had to add some more working groups, right? Because people kind of saw a need to do some other things, right? Like, hey, we need to talk about like direct greenhouse gas regulation work. We created this global warming solutions group. Then folks were like, well, actually, like transportation is 30% of the emissions. We got to add a transportation working group. Okay, so we did that too. And then folks were like, no, but we got this local solutions work happening too. And we really need like a group for people working on local solutions. And we're like, okay, fine. Like we'll create a working group for that. So we had these 6 working groups. And then people were like, but we also like care about like these constituencies, right? Like we need to like build power and help folks that are like in the faith community or the rural communities or and environmental justice groups. We need to have a space for young people to have a voice. So we created all these caucuses, but the caucuses were treated differently than working groups. Caucus leaders were primarily appointed by the steering committee, and they didn't have a seat at the steering committee, so they didn't have a seat at the decision making table. Of course, they were accountable to maybe members that were working within that caucus, but otherwise, like they like the working group associates, like they were just kind of floating out there. They were the ones closest and working closest to the membership. They also had the least ability to have influence, I would say, over like what decisions are being made or how decisions are being made. That was really primarily left to the working group leaders and the funders of the network. Then, on top of all this, we had to add a few more things because we needed more things, right? I feel like in the early days of Reamp, we had this problem of being a Christmas tree where we wanted everybody to be able to hang their ornament until at some point, like the Christmas tree gets too big and it can't, like there's too many ornaments and it just can't sustain it. But we created this like federal connections task force group because we cared about like what was happening at the federal level. And then we were like, but we need communication support too. Like, let's have a media center. And then we were like, wow, there's like all these like different things going on and we actually don't know what's really happening between groups. We need a synergy committee because we need working group leaders and associates and caucus leaders and maybe some of these folks that are on the steering committee to be talking together too. The whole point of this picture was really just to tell you like how messy things got. Like we grew so big so fast and we were so linear in terms of like, who got to make decisions, how decisions were going to be made, that it was just like, okay, like if there was enough energy for something, we were just going to add it. At this time too, it's I laugh because it's funny to think about these things in retrospect, but we really had no clear definitions other than that North Star goal. Early on, we didn't even have a membership list. So we didn't have membership guidelines. We didn't know who could be a member, who couldn't be a member. Again, we had all these questions about like, how are decisions going to get made? It was just really challenging. For the most part, the steering committee was the one who was making decisions. But everybody was just so nice. We're Midwesterners, so we have this problem inherently of being too nice. And I feel like it often left us paralyzed to really do anything differently. We carried on with business as usual for quite a long time. Um, I also, as I'm talking about these growing pains, I do want to point out that like a lot of really good, exciting things came from the work that we did early on. And, I think we really did have a big influence on helping members think differently about their work. For example, like through this systems approach, we were able to do some analysis early on about all this great energy efficiency work that was happening in Illinois and realized it was being negated by all the flaring that was happening in North Dakota. Flaring is when you have like an oil well and they burn off the methane. So they're literally like, there's just these like fire sticks hanging out across the landscape. Members in North Dakota didn't know this. But once they realized this, right, like as a network, we collectively realized this, members there decided, like, okay, you know what, we're going to do some more work here to reduce flaring that's happening here. As we did analysis together and we saw the need to like do more build out of clean energy in places like the Dakotas, we realized the need collectively to like work on some transmission. How are we going to, carry some of this power if we're going to have to do this build out in rural areas, especially the rural parts of the Midwest? How are we going to get that to other like places here in, like Chicago, for example? So, I mean, I can't like underscore the importance because we really did fund a lot of great work. Our members did amazing things. Like we stopped the coal rush here in the Midwest. So I really don't want to underscore the importance of the work that happened, even though I'm going to be talking about like some of these growing pains and some of the things that we've done differently, as things started not to work for us. I actually think that was one of the biggest lessons for Reamp is, being more comfortable with letting go. Things are always changing. Our membership is changing. Our funders are changing. The world around us is changing. And you know what? As a network, you have to be adaptable as well. And I think that was one of our big life lessons that we learned. Um, Going back to the growth of Reamp, I know Sonia had said, like, right now today we have 5 full-time employees. At one point, I would say, kind of like at our peak, we had 7 full-time employees and 12 part-time employees. So folks that were also being supported by the network. It was really, really big. That is until things don't work. We've also gone through major staff contractions at well. I do remember being on staff when we went through a big transition, really around this time that I'm going to talk about next time around, when we really shifted to really like centering equity into our work in a meaningful way. We contracted down to only 3 full-time employees for a short time. And we're currently at 5, which feels pretty good. Um, but one of the things that we did learn in terms of staffing is it was actually really important for us to have central staff. Like early on, as I was describing some of these structures, right? At this time that you're looking at, we didn't have anybody we had like a network coordinator who basically did like administrative duties, like, find a venue for the annual meeting, take notes for the steering committee, make sure that the grant reports got out or the grant agreements got out from the strategic action fund. One person was responsible for all of that. And in around like 2016 is when we made the decision to, well, I guess a little bit earlier than that, maybe around 2014, we started hiring more central staff. And that actually was really important for us because they were accountable to somebody. And they were able to kind of see the network at the 10,000-foot level. So it was probably around like this 2014, 2015 time. We were really kind of getting paralyzed, right? We were having a hard time making decisions together. And somebody in the network said, you know what we need? We need a skipper for this ship. We're like, a skipper? Oh, you mean a CEO? Okay. We called it a chief network officer at the time, but we didn't even have a chief, like a CEO for Reamp until about that like 2015. I think we hired our first one in 2015. And that was, again, around the time when we started adding more central staff. And while I would say we still have a very delineated way of making decisions, like we do have a chief network officer. We call her a CEO now, but we do have somebody who's like that point person, who's overseeing like the programmatic work that's happening, who's overseeing the staff, who's accountable to that steering committee. And that has actually made a really big difference. It really allowed us to like make decisions and be able to pivot, and I would say really meet our mission and our core values in a much better way. Let's go over to the next slide. One of the things that I had mentioned at the beginning of Reamp's kind of start was that we had this desire to break down hierarchical relationships between advocates and funders. And this was really, I feel like, lived through our Global Warming Strategic Action Fund, the Action Fund. When Reamp got started, as funders were putting money into this pot and we decided how to spend it out, we called it the prime time process. Because what we were really interested in funding were campaigns that were ripe for wins, that with a little bit of money, it was really just going to kind of push them over the edge, right? And we can win. And again, like we funded some really amazing work, really great things got done. We helped like get renewable energy standards implemented in most of our states. We did a lot of work on energy efficiency. Like I said before, we were able to stop that coal rush. But what over time is that this process actually created a lot of competition and didn't encourage collaboration as much as we had hoped. And the reason is that we were asking groups to come together once a year at a state level to make decisions about campaigns to put forward. And people just weren't in a place to have a really difficult conversation like that. First off, they didn't have any real awareness around the work that each other is doing, right? If you were working on energy efficiency, you knew that work really well and those people, but you had no clue what the folks who were working on transportation were doing. And then as you come together in a room and you're trying to decide whose campaign is more important, it really became a popularity contest. So like we saw a lot of folks like doing a lot of work ahead of the meeting to like, organize the votes in support of their proposal. We saw work that was probably really important to move forward that just didn't have enough oomph behind it, enough of the votes to be funded. And even at the state level, what we saw was that, states that were already doing very well in terms of like implementing climate policies, like they really benefited heavily from this process because they were prime time. But states that were in a really poor context, like think of North Dakota, right? Like, what in North Dakota is ever going to be prime time ready? No, there's a lot of work to do there from the bottom up to really grow power and to be able to put that state in a position where it's ready for prime time. So that's just what we noticed is like this just really wasn't working for us. And while the prime time was designed to, again, like, fund those campaigns that were ripe for wins, they were also intended to really help meet the goals of those working groups that I talked about. But here was the secret with the working group goals. We set them ourselves. And nobody ever was in charge of like looking across these goals and saying, oh, yeah, this is going to help us get to that 80% by 2050 that we want to go to. So we just didn't really have any cohesiveness between like what was happening with members in these working groups, what is that like guiding light North Star that we're working towards, and what work are we supporting along the way to really get there. So it was just it was really, really messy. Um, so some of the shifts that we did here, you can actually go to the next slide, is so along the way, we'd actually done a lot of, I would say, really good work in terms of kind of evaluating and collecting data and information over time to be able to reflect on what we needed to do differently as a network. We had done things like, we did network assessments. We had Pete Plastrick, who wrote Connecting to Change the World, do an assessment of REAMP. We do these annual member surveys. We have one-on-one conversations. We had an environmental justice assessment. We had somebody come in and do some interviews and review our funding guidelines. We also had this role that we had called either a learning in progress analyst or a knowledge manager. This was the person who was like kind of responsible for like reading through reports, like synthesizing learnings, like writing reports about what was learned from members and sharing that back out. So we did have a lot of this like data and information. So one of the things that we first did was we actually revamped our funding process. And we said, look, like first off, what is REAMP's niche in this world? And what is it that our members need in order to be more strategic and be more successful? So we made a decision to really fund states at a state level to come together more regularly, right? It's hard for them to come in that room once a year and make decisions about money. Well, let's give them the time and space to build relationships, and so that they can kind of think strategically together all year. So we really invested in what we called at that time a state table. We also kind of moved away from like this prime time like campaigns that are ready to go and thought more about like what are the things that are going to build power for us over the long term. And I think something else that was really helpful in terms of helping us kind of get our foothold here was we had hired Melissa Gavin, our current chief executive officer, around 2016, 2017. And what she did was she realized that we just didn't even have enough clarity about who we are and what we're trying to do together, which seems silly, right? I said we had this North Star goal, but we didn't have a mission. We didn't have a vision. We didn't have values. When people did talk about REAMP, we were all talking about it in a little bit different way. And especially when you're going to make decisions together about a network and even thinking about this prime time process, our funding process, like what are the values of the network, right? And how are they being expressed in the ways that we're doing things, the things that we're funding, and the ways that we're bringing people together? Like that was really important. Again, like the motto and the North Star goal were helpful early on, but we needed a little bit more. We needed a little bit more clarity, a little bit more boundary around us. And, we also really needed to embed equity into our work. Um, and while, we thought that electing working group leaders was a really great way of getting like member participation and voice into it. What we realized is that actually wasn't really helping us work equitably because honestly, like once a working group leader was elected, they basically ran unopposed and got elected every time thereafter. There wasn't any real competition in the system. And we saw a lot of, cis white men that were leading these groups, quite frankly. So we just saw a need to really kind of change our structure and change what we were funding in the network as well to really bring some more cohesiveness around it. We did a few other things too. We kind of revised our systems approach. We moved away from like one single static analysis to doing more good ongoing analysis. We have already updated our North Star goal. We adopted the Hermes principles. Our steering committee put together an equity statement. And all these things really kind of helped us rethink about how we're bringing people together, how we're making decisions, what ways are we making decisions, and how can we really bring clarity and transparency to everybody around it. I mentioned this already too, but like we just really needed to invest in the relationships. And I'm sorry, Christy, you can go to the next slide too. We really needed to take the time for those relationships to be made. So besides like our funding guidelines, like we are just really intentional with our meeting designs. We even create some fun social programs, like we launched this Breakfast Buddies program where we have a seasoned network member have breakfast with somebody who's new to the network. And it's just simply that. It's just a conversation between two people to get to know each other and build some of the connective tissue that's happening there. We've done conga lines through hotel lobbies. We've taken 12-hour bus rides together at our annual meeting through the Bakken. And we've done some social systems mapping too, which I think you guys might be somewhat familiar with. And I want to talk a lot more about that maybe next time, to talk about how like that data and that visualization has really helped us be a lot better about building relationships here in our network. We also realized, like going back to like not having any boundaries or rules for the road, like ramp is big, it's complex, there's a lot of things going on, and it's really important that we orient people. We actually strive to really try to give people an orientation within 2 weeks of coming on board to the network. And we've done a much better job of being able to boil down like what it means to be a member of ramp, whereas before we were kind of all over the place, right? It kind of meant everything, right? Like that Christmas tree. But now we have a lot more clarity, and we're able to digest that. And not only am I repeating that in orientation, but members hear this all the time from other staff and in the ways that we're bringing people together. This getting married to structure, I think, for us, like some of our growing pains early on were the fact that like we were feeling this tension from within that we needed to evolve, but we were paralyzed to do so. So, you really can't we've learned that you can't get married to structure. It's you got to have that flexibility to be able to evolve, to adapt, whether that's your funding, the structure in your network, your staffing, whatever that looks like. Like you really do have to be flexible, and allow yourself to be responsive to the network. And we creating that culture from within and really kind of like doing things for yourself. When we started early on in REAM, we relied a lot on outside consultants, facilitators, and experts to tell us about what we needed to do. But what we've realized over time is actually like investing in ourselves to do that type of work for ourselves is more meaningful, and it's more long lasting. Those things are the things that really stick with us. So, we'll pay our members to do the research or analysis that needs to happen today rather than an outsider. If we're needing a co-facilitator at a meeting, I mean, there are cases, of course, where we might bring in an outside facilitator, but for the most part, we're really relying on the expertise of our members. And in fact, by doing that and having co-facilitators with us as staff, we're actually helping develop the next set of leaders here in REAM. We invest in our staff, honestly. Like I think this is so important. Our strategic director, she got her master's in systems thinking while she was working for the network. I went through the human systems dynamics training program, and we have a lot of other ways where we're really investing in our staff because how we show up really reflects like who we are as a network, and it's infectious, right? The way that we do things, our members see us modeling that, and we then in turn we see them modeling after us as well. Um, so, I think there's a lot that we've learned. Like I said, like there are so many stories, so many things I could talk about. I really try to maybe hit some of the highlights for you. But what I do have for you to take away is we've tried to boil down what we've learned into these core network thinking concepts. And like this is our own material. We did host a network thinking academy, and this is kind of a distillation of our learnings, especially from these early years and up until about 2019. Just if we were going to think about like what we've learned over time, how would we put that into like a principle that other people who are working in networks or trying to do their network work might find valuable? So I see that Christy put that in the chat for you already. you're welcome to, share that if you want. But it's just there for you to maybe reflect on a little bit and thinking about your own context and, what you might be wanting to do differently or what you might be trying to achieve overall. So I feel like maybe might now be a time to go into some questions.
Yeah.
I did have an exercise for this, but I feel like I did talk more than I expected to, and we got started a little late, so maybe we should just open it up. But
No, thank you. That's
happy to
great.
go whichever route.
That's great. Yeah, we have three great questions I think we can hop into. And we're scheduled until 11, but Sarah is staying on till 11:30 with that extra 30 minutes for anybody who wants to stay on and dig a little deeper with her. So, oh, that is not, hmm, that's weird. Can you, Christy, find the right link for that print? Yeah, they should be easy to find in the drive. So the first question from Rob is, experiencing the systems mapping process together is so crucial. It's not the map itself that matters, but the process. I will be curious to hear how new partners who are not part of the mapping process are onboarded to the shared mission.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel like for us, when we did have that static analysis, this was part of the challenge, right? Like, first off, the analysis just got a little outdated, to be honest, and not everybody had ownership over it. Today, what we do is we do a lot more of like ongoing analysis. I can actually grab a link for a page on our public website where this is where we've really been investing in member led analysis. And I agree. It's like it's totally the process that makes a big difference. Although what we've also found to be, in addition to that, really useful is when you do have like a discrete piece of work and people are coming together to even like do the strategizing around that. So as long as like we can get on board and agree that like, okay, like here's our grounding, like we kind of agree on like this is what the lay of the land is. In some cases people may have contributed to it. In other cases maybe they're not. But we still give them a chance to kind of like here, like learn about it. This is what we're seeing. Like, does this jive with you? Okay, for the most part that's fine. And where people really want to have a voice and have a say and feel like they're contributing is when we're doing the strategy making. Right? That's where people really want to like lend their expertise, and that's where we really need to be careful about like meeting design and setup and facilitation to make sure that those who have already been involved for so long don't steamroll over the people who are new, right? And are just like trying to bring their wisdom and expertise into the room too.
Sarah, it struck me that obviously systems thinking is an important piece of the success of this network. And that's what I'm really interested in is how do you, as newer members come in, I mean, has the importance of systems thinking kind of faded a little bit as you've had more tangible, target oriented work? Or like, what do you do to kind of help those that may come in without that capacity, kind of understand what that means and how that
Mm,
informs, when the groups or working groups get together?
perfect. Great. So, number one, we do orient them. So they hear about all this stuff during an orientation. They get to experience it a little bit with our social systems map that I'll show you guys at the next training. Um, but the other thing that we do too is like our systems thinking practices show up in our meeting design. So like you're coming to a summit about energy democracy, we're going to be using some systems thinking tools and practices to have that conversation. We love using things like the iceberg model. We came up with these 4 R's like resist, reform, recreate, reimagine, and helping people kind of step and understand like each of those ways of thinking and doing and appreciating the relationship between them. We also run a reamp systems thinking academy. So every year we have an offering to members. It's by application, but members get a chance to learn more about the theory and practice of thinking systemically for themselves. So they bring their own situation of interest to the academy. We teach them methods, models, tools. They apply them to their own situation in real time. And we also usually ask them to give something back to the network for coming to that training. So maybe it's something as simple as like they're going to write a letter for the newsletter or write an article for the newsletter. In other cases, maybe they're going to co-facilitate the next summit and use those skills that they've learned from the network and give back.
Thanks, Sarah. This link should be right. If you could, Christy, if you could click on it in the chat box and make sure it goes to the right place, the core network thinking concepts. All right, we have another actually question from Rob here, and then a question from.
I'll defer. Please go into someone else's question since I
Okay,
just had some screen time. Thank you.
Sure, I can come back. Here are my notes. So from Casey, she said, "This is so great. Can you talk a bit about how you balanced your need to advance collaborative work together and the need to spend time setting up your governance and network infrastructure practices? It seems like there's often a tension there from a time perspective."
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good question. It's hard. How about that? Can I just say that it's really hard to do? The beauty of a network though is that there's so many people. So while you could have some people that are doing some work, like maybe these folks are really focused on stopping that coal rush, and that's fine. We have other folks in the network that we can tap into for expertise if we need to talk about like putting together a set of membership guidelines. And then you need to just find ways to get feedback from everybody overall, right? So it's really about like setting up a really good process. You don't have to expect everybody to do everything at every single moment. And just I would say, be ready for things to take time. I mean, just things move slower sometimes in a network, especially when it comes time to like making decisions, going through processes, setting up those processes. Like they just take time. And then you just got to come back and revisit those things every year. Like we've had membership guidelines since like 2015 or something like that, but we revisit them every year and they haven't stayed the same every single year. In fact, this year we implemented membership dues for the first time. So I mean, it's kind of like the life of a network, right? It is a living organism. Don't think of it as something that's like static and ever and always. But it's alive, and as you feed it, it's going to change and adapt and grow, and you kind of have to change and adapt and grow with it as well.
Hey, Sarah, I've got a question for you. You talked about the transition in the early days. You did not have sort of your chief network officer, now your chief executive officer, and then how that was really helpful for you all in having that point person moving forward. How effective has shared decision making been with like such a strong staff, including your chief executive officer? Like, do you still create mechanisms for that shared decision making? Or if you could talk about that, what that looks like, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. Well, this is all about like having those policies and procedures and policies like clearly defined together, right? And I would say one of our principles as staff is we never do anything alone. So I cannot think of an instance where we as staff or even Melissa would make a decision just like unilaterally, right? Like we're always checking in like, okay, first off, like what are we sensing from the membership overall? Okay, like now let's engage with our steering committee. Our steering committee is elected at large by the membership. We have 10 people sitting on that committee. So we're checking in with them. And we may have an idea of something that we want to change, and we got to kind of reintroduce that back to the full membership, and get some more feedback and kind of continue to refine it that way. So it's always a process, but what we have found for REAMP is the most important thing is just like having the process clearly defined and transparent. If people, like, even if you aren't going to be happy with the outcome, as long as you know at the forefront, like what is expected and how we're going to be going about doing it, and we stay true to that, like people are going to be okay with the outcome at the end.
Thanks, Sarah. Question about membership. Was the decision to have membership dues to generate revenue, or was it to engage organizations in other ways?
Both. So it was definitely about diversifying our revenue. And social science tells us that people value things that they pay for more than things that they don't. So what we are really looking for here is like, we want members who are committed to REAMP to be part of REAMP. And by paying a financial due, like you are really committing yourself to REAMP. Now, we've gone through the process too of like, it took us three or 4 years to implement dues. Like from when the first idea came out that like people are like, let's think, like we really want to consider this hard. It was our steering committee who said it. So then we came together, we had a membership committee created. The membership committee did some research from our members. We talked to other organizations who went to a dues paying fee. We came up with some recommendations. We took that to the steering committee. They did some refining. It went back to the committee. We checked in again with the membership. Like, it took us 3 or 4 years to come up with that policy and to roll it out this year. And, to be expected, we've had some members who haven't renewed, and probably a little bit more than what we normally have. That's okay. We've also had like 10 new members join the network already this year. So there's always going to be this like shifting amongst your membership. Like even your membership doesn't stay static, I would say, in a network. It's also very fluid and changes over time.
Thanks. Any, just open it up to any questions folks want to ask right now. We have one more question too from Rob here, but I wanted to see if anyone wanted to come off mute. Art, uh-oh, you got multiple computers. You might have to go.
Yeah. Hey, sorry about the feedback. So Sarah, like in the REAMP network, I'm curious, like, are there like federal, state, local government employed people in that network? And if so, what kind of role do they play? And I say this because, in the role, the Regional Outdoor Learning Network, there's a fair number of kind of folks that either work for the state government or federal government that are part of it. And I'm just wondering how they show up, how they operate, and what kind of works from your perspective in space.
Yeah, that one's tricky. We don't. Our membership is solely organizations, nonprofit organizations. And we do have a handful of like individual members. We don't have anybody who's affiliated with government. For us, that was a decision made because we are worried about privacy. And folks who work in government are subject to like open records requests, laws and things like that. So communications that may be happening, especially if we're talking strategy wise, if it could be open to public records requests then. So for us, it was like a privacy thing, which is why we chose not to go down that road. But I do know that there are other networks similar to REAMP that do have government officials as part of it. So it's doable. It's just a choice that we made not to include.
That's deep.
My other quick question, I'll just take advantage here, was just, I guess I was curious, to what extent has the network blurred the organizational boundaries? So has there been a lot of integration of the organizations, or is it, more like a coordination based where there's still a lot of organizational autonomy? And I think, Bart, I really appreciate your question, because that was something that occurred to me too, that when you have just nonprofit organizations or just, social movement organizations, that's a different ability, because the network I work in is a combination of both. And that is one thing that's been very clear of both culture, but also just constraints on what can and can't be done, or how that organization will work. So how much integration has happened, blurring of organizational boundaries, Sarah?
Yeah, our organizations are extremely autonomous. Like we help align people as to the best of our ability, but we are not always marching in lockstep, doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. And our members all have their own work, right? And their own expertise and their own sort of niche. And we know that this at some point actually does cause tension in the network. So like, let's think about an issue of like carbon capture and sequestration. We have environmental justice groups in our network who are like, absolutely no way, that is a false solution. We cannot like support that. We have technical assistance type of members who are interested in those type of policies and have the expertise to help develop it if they want to. As a network, we just don't have a position about that, right? And we're going to focus in on some of the areas that we really care about. Something that's different for us today that I would say brings us into alignment around the work that we're going to do together is we have a set of network priorities now. We don't have working groups anymore. We have some hubs, we have action teams, we have state tables. These are just different words for different forms of collaboration. And it's through our network priorities that we actually have a process that we review every 3 years with our members and with our steering committee to set these strategic priorities. And these strategic priorities mean that's where we're going to be concentrating our time and our energy and our resources around. For us, for REAMP, like what we're delivering is the 3 C's. We're delivering connections and building those relationships. We're creating the stage and setting the conditions for the strategy to be developed. And then we're also making space for folks to have the capacity building and to really kind of do some of that professional development work. So as a network, we've agreed on these 5 priorities. That's where we're concentrating those time and energy and resources. And for members that are doing those type of works, they're going to step in and align around those as it makes sense for them. If it doesn't, then we do have members that are just less active. And that's okay. You know, when we revisit these priorities next year, maybe industrial emissions is going to be a new priority. And those groups that have maybe been on the edge are going to start engaging because that's work that aligns with what they're doing already.
Awesome. Thank you. It is the bottom of the hour. Christy was just going to offer a few closing words for anybody who has to leave. Is anybody hopping off? Because we could hold off on that. Just raise your hand or give me an emoji if you have to hop off right now. All right, so maybe we could, if it's just Rob, maybe we could just pop the registration for part 2 for anybody who has to hop off, and an evaluation form. And in the evaluation form, there is a spot for any questions that could help shape the second session too, which will be really kind of focusing in on more detail around like tools and processes and things like that on April 26th. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate you being here.
Can I share this link with other members of our network that are part of the, they're in there? Okay.
Yeah. The
Thanks.
more the merrier.
Hey, Rob, before you go, like in general, we would, what we offer or what we're like advertising through the networks, through the CBI initiative, through the Roland network work is we want to be distributed, and the more the merrier, even if it goes a little bit outside of the network proper, that is fantastic. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the flexible part of the program. I know that Sarah does have, another activity to put you back in breakouts, but wanted to open it up to deeper questions. I have like 20, but I'm gonna wait.
It's totally open. This is like the free for all right now.
I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna shut up
You,
for a
you
second.
can. Now's the time for your own self-interested question, I suppose, right?
That's right.
So,
You're like in a music
I'm sorry
video.
about that again.
Art,
So I was, Sarah, I was thinking about the mapping and the fact that, and Chris, you comment on it, like it took a year, right, to be really thoughtful about bringing that map together and working on it. I guess like part of like what's in my head is like the kind of significance of that for the overall work. It seems pretty huge, right? But that time to do that much work on the mapping is sometimes hard. Your capacity is a challenge all the time. So I was just kind of this circling around in my head. Like I think it's really important to know what the connections are and know what the orientation of the work is. But the patience it takes to develop it and really kind of feed it is like, it's hard. I'm not sure how to incentivize it or like, should we, or how you all incentivized the consistent and persistent work over the course of a year in that kind of space.
Yeah, I think it was largely driven by the funder at the time, honestly. I mean, it's kind of our advocate behavior, right? There was money on the table. The money was to do this thing. We want the money, so we'll do the thing that you're asking us to do. So I think, a lot of it was driven by that. And I mean, like, I think people early on too, though, just had this idea that like they had that feeling, right? They knew that things just weren't working, right? Like business as usual is not working for us, right? Especially here in the Midwest. And so I do think people were very hungry to try something different. So like, I'm willing to give this a go because I'm tired of like how things have always been. So I think there's a combination of those two that really made a difference. Even for reamp today though, like we still do like our own good ongoing analysis. I'm actually going to share a link from our website right now where we put together like, some more reports of analysis that we've done. We've done a more sector specific, but even in these cases, like these are reports that members took well over a year to put together. We also did compensate them for their time. So like here is a place where I think like the money does matter, and it does like give people the time and the space to do the things that they want to do that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do because their regular job is demanding them to do something else. I also believe at that time too, they probably had a facilitator. So while people were like kind of like contributing and participating, there was also somebody who was like kind of doing all like the administrative type of work and the synthesizing, right? And like digesting things and putting them back out. Like somebody kind of had to play that role too as well. So I think that was also probably a big help for it.
I'd love to know just kind of like your biggest, like how has the map been most helpful for your work?
Our our systems map,
Your people map.
our old well, oh, our social systems map.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were talking about our other one. Okay, well here, let me kind of see it. So this is something you're getting a little spoiler. I was going to show this for next time around, but you can see it now. It's not a big deal. So one of the things that we also did in reamp, right? Like you heard a lot about like our systems mapping in terms of thinking about the difference we're going to make on climate and energy here in the Midwest. Around like 2016, we were inspired to say, okay, like what if we were going to like take this systems thinking approach and apply it to like the network? Like what would we notice about reamp that's different, and how might this help us like kind of see ourselves differently? And I can't zoom in super closely to like preserve the anonymity of my members, but what you see here, at least right now, is like a bunch of circles. These are people. This is a member directory for us. And we have some other views that also include the relationships as well. But this systems mapping work that we decided to do, it took a long time. Like I'll talk more about that later, but it really has made a difference. This may sound silly, but I've been running orientation since 2016. And when I first started doing orientations and I talk about reamp, and granted we weren't doing a great job, I would feel like, of explaining ourselves at the time, like people were just overwhelmed. They're like, okay, cool, that was great. I just drank from a fire hose and I have no idea what I want now. But we started showing this map at the orientation, and it actually just like helped it click for people. Like, oh, reamp is just this collection of human beings. Oh, like I know how to relate to other people. You know what? Actually, like I'm working on this like utility scale solar project in Minnesota. Do you think there's anybody else in the network who might want to do that? And what we've done then is we've built these filters into our map where we can then kind of filter in and find folks that might be doing similar work. We may not be able to get like exact, but we can start to get close, and we can examine together then the universe of people that may fit that criteria. So like if we were like first, like, let's look at the people just working in Minnesota. And this would be somebody working in energy democracy probably. And they're probably working with businesses and utilities. Like now you can see how much smaller that list of people is than it was before. So it's been incredibly valuable for helping us like find those people in reamp that you otherwise wouldn't know, because there are 500 individuals that make up reamp. No way, like especially if you're new, that you're going to know these people, right? Maybe you know people in your state, but likely you don't know anybody else across the region. And how would you be aware of the work that they would be doing either? So the map has really been useful for that. I'll show you the involvement one really quick too. This is a view that includes the relationships between people. And as network practitioners, this is really useful for us because now we can be very intentional about our network building. Because as people become more connected, they're going to be more centrally located in the map. If they're on the edges, they're less connected. So it's my job as a network builder, as a network practitioner, to like figure out what people are doing on the edge and find ways to like get them to fly to the center. And what we've noticed in reamp at least is like, people kind of like come into the middle and they're here for a little bit and they kind of fly back out to the edge. you know, and they have this like little pattern that they fly in and out of. And that's perfect because it helps us like keep building leadership. We aren't always relying on the same like 10 people to do everything. As people really like get deep and get reampy, I guess to say, they take that back out with them into the world around them, right? Like the practices, the ways that we are here in reamp together, like they carry that out into their coalitions, into their campaign, into their organization as well. So it really actually just kind of builds the field overall. The other thing that we have found this to be really useful of, and I actually wish I had my old map pictures up right now because that would be perfect. But we can also look at the network with these network of relationships based on our strategic priorities, right? Because our business is in REAMP is about making connections, creating strategy, and building capacity. So when we looked at something like energy democracy, like this view for us wasn't surprising. Like we have a lot of people working in this area, you know, quite a few connections, a lot of, you know, a few folks in the middle, and we have a long history of working on the power sector. So like not that surprising of a view. But if we compared this to agriculture, this is a view where we can see, wow, this is a newer priority. And we have far fewer connections here. We have fewer people in the middle of the network, and we got some work to do around network building here. In our previous iteration of the map, this was actually really important for our transportation work because at the time we were split. We were doing like electrical vehicle work and we were doing reducing vehicle miles traveled. And when we saw the map, we saw a stark difference. Like it was all of like the big, you know, traditional environmental organizations were all working on electric vehicles, and only a handful of folks were working on VMTs, and they were all smaller organizations. And since we care about equitably eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, we made a conscious decision after seeing that to really focus on that portion of transportation work for our network, right? It's our niche, it's in line with our values, and it's still in service of our North Star goal. And we always had a sense in our gut about it, but seeing the map is actually what led us to really like make a big change about it, I would say, and really double down on that portion of transportation.
Thank you. So interesting. Any other burning questions? Okay, well, I am very, so your three C's are connections, uh, co-creating strategy, and capacity. Are those what the three C's stand
Look at that. You're like a network member already.
Messaging is so important. Yeah, that like distilling things down into three words, I think is very helpful for people to understand, you know, what you're doing at the core. So yeah, I'm a network communications like, you know, dork, and that's what I'm into. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you've figured out how to, you know, this is something we constantly see is networks, organizations, really everybody have a hard time figuring out how to best convey their stories, how to collect their stories, how to convey their stories, how to compress their stories, how to effectively message. Like there's a lot of networks that are like working on this together, right? And then aligning around their messaging too. So I'd love to know more about how you've gotten there. You know, that's that kind of strategic messaging, and then how just some of your strategic network communications work, even like the tools that you have that you really like, that have maybe promoted that multi-directional communication, or are you kind of like the hub at the center, or are people like, what are the ways you've been able to enhance multi-directional communication without being a gatekeeper at the center, if you've been able to do
Well,
that?
those are hard. Those are hard questions.
They
So
are.
when somebody does figure out like the secret sauce for that, please let me know too. For us, it's honestly been a lot of like trial and error, right? It's like, okay, like this is what I'm going to say about it. Okay, how do I make that simpler? This is what I'm going to say about it. Okay, how do I make that even simpler? Like we keep trying to like boil things down and make them a little bit simpler. I think for us personally, like when we got our mission, vision, and values, that actually gave us a lot more clarity around our purpose and what it is that we're really offering members. Like, what is REAMP in the business of? REAMP is in the business of the 3 C's, because that's how we're going to meet our mission, and that's how we live into our values here in REAMP. So I think that really helped us. But like for our orientations and for like those 3 C's, like honestly, like we just kept asking ourselves, like, okay, like how do we make this simpler? How do we make this simpler? And that just kind of grew over time. In terms of how people like in the network communicate, one of the things that we have invested in, and we've had this for a long time, although we've had a lot of like really crappy iterations of it, is a website. We describe it actually as an online collaborative platform because it does give people the ability to connect with each other and collaborate and have everything that they need. First and foremost, when people come to the website, they do get to create a profile. And it's the profile that they give us here on our online collaborative platform that helps populate the information in that network map. We actually export this information from our site and use it to create those profiles about people on the map, which we then can use for strategic connections. But the tool that we rely on most here, and again, like our site is a love-hate relationship. Some people love it, some people hate it. We're always trying to find ways to make it easier to use. But we have these things called groups. And these groups are like these one-stop shops we have for all of our collaborative needs. Apparently I'm not logged in all of a sudden, even though you just saw my picture there. The groups are the one-stop shop for collaboration. We can create and dissolve groups as we need. We can have members and we can give non-members a limited logged in view to a specific group. So this is a service we also offer to our members if for any reason they need like, a listserv, a membership page, whatever that looks like, they can get that here. So we do have public groups, we have private groups, you can see how many people are in a group, and you can change your email. We do have one listserv here, this REAMP Commons. That's for every individual in the network. So if you wanted to send a message to every human in REAMP, that's where you'd use it. Otherwise, we have these like much more specific topic groups, right? Are you in the Ag Hub? That's where you'd want to go. I have an annual meeting planning committee, right? Like we have our own private group where we do our communications. And when we go to these groups, like I said, we have everything we need here to collaborate. We have a forum where we can send messages to each other. So you can click on this, you could reply directly. You could also start a new topic. When you start a new topic, you hit submit, like after your message is ready to go. It emails everybody in the group. It also populates it here to the group online. Most people hyperlink to documents, but if they have a hard copy they wanted to share, you can post that here. We don't have a lot of people using this, but we did an end of the year review. Any member can share an event. So maybe like, the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy just, had a new report that they issued and they're having a webinar about it. They could come here and share it to the Ag and Food Systems Hub group. People might be interested in it, right? They're in the same issue area. And then you can also see who's a member of each group. So these are folks that are all said, hey, I'm interested in Ag and Food Systems work, right? You could click on their name and check out their profiles as well. And people can also like control how much mail they get from every group. They're going to be automatically subscribed to get all email, but they have the option to choose what they want. And then we have a few things over here too in a group where you can pin some group resources. So if you want things that are easy for people in a group to find no matter what, it'll automatically generate upcoming events and latest group files as well. This is the tool that we probably use most frequently. We also do things like a network newsletter. We have a lot of like these small group collaborations too. So like we do support like state level collaborative work, but we don't control their communications platforms or anything like that. Like they have their own methods for communicating. Some of them do use the site, some of them don't. But people have the flexibility to do that. It's a service we offer. We use it for like priorities primarily, but other like action teams or collaborative projects or whatever that we may be supporting financially or in other ways, they don't necessarily have to use this. They're also able to create their own methods for communication.
Awesome. And I see this as it looks like a WordPress site. Is this another like widget within WordPress, that system, that specific system?
Yeah, it is a WordPress-based site, and I think it's BuddyPress that we use to create the groups.
Okay.
But I could be wrong about that.
Cool. Thank you.
But I will say that we use Megaphone Technology as like our developer, and they're amazing, so I highly recommend them.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we got about 10 minutes left. Anything coming up for folks? We got
Oh,
some
I did
network
see there was
hard
Candace had
hitters.
a question. I see that Candace had a question here about the platform that we use for our network
Oh, yeah.
map.
I did answer that, but if you want to talk more about it.
Yeah. So we actually use two tools for this. We use SumApp and we use Kumu. Kumu is a way to take tables of spreadsheets of information and visualize them. SumApp is a tool that you can use to collect information about people. We're using our site for that, but we have to load all that information into SumApp. And it's a way for us to collect this relationship information between members. So members would come in and self-report those relationships, and it also gives them access to the map as well. And I'm wondering if, oh, I did actually have one pulled up already. It's a really easy tool to use. We found it to be extremely powerful and useful. Here I'm in my own where I can tell people about the connections. We can do some filtering of this list by state or priority because we know that's where people are most likely to know one another within. But this is the tool that we're using. And even for us to develop like these set of questions in terms of how we know each other or what our map views are going to look like, just the launch of our network map, this also took us an incredible amount of time. Like we started off with like a Kumu peer learning circle that took like 7 or so months. And it was still probably another 6 to 8 months after that before we started like rolling our map out to the whole network. So it was probably about a year of getting ready before every other person in the network even knew that we had a network map. But it's something we do use, like we use it one-on-ones. I show it in the orientation. We use it at the annual meeting every year because we're looking and seeing like what has changed, especially in terms of relationship building in REAMP, since that's the foundation for everything we're doing together. And I think this year we're actually going to use it to try and collect stories. Next year is going to be our 20th anniversary, and I think we want to try to figure out ways to use the map to kind of help collect and archive, just some of the impacts REAMP has had on members and work over the last 20 years.
Awesome. Christy.
Hey, Sarah, so we've done and you helped participate in some of this about a year ago, some real scratching the surface network mapping using social system mapping using the SumApp and Kumu. And I'm wondering sort of how often do you find that individual members are using this tool, or is it really, I heard you say you had a circle that was formed around it. I know that you all use it as kind of the core staff for REAMP. And maybe that's enough. So I'm just kind of curious to know, like, what are the expectations that you have in terms of use when you think about individual use and like your networks, backbone team use or your staff use and the work group use, for example, like, or you don't have work groups anymore, your action teams. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yep. Yeah, so we do have everybody on the map now. So everybody does have their own unique link to access the map. I don't think individuals go and use the map very often. That is my intuition around it. I think there's some people who get really excited about it and they might play around with it maybe right after the orientation and they've been invited, but I don't think they really think about it unless they're prompted to beyond that. So we actually do a lot of the prompting. So if it's like, hey, like this action team is starting to form, like I would reach out to the person who is leading that and say, hey, like, could we find a time to sit down and look at the map and see who else might be interested in your action team and ask them to join? We really invite people to come in and contribute to the map around meeting times. Because like people are just already thinking about it, it's on the mind, like they're ready to do the prep work. So that's a time for us to really do a lot of good information gathering is around in-person meetings or like our annual meeting, because at the annual meeting we're going to be showcasing it too. My staff are aware of it, but I'm definitely the holder of the map. So I'm the one who's mostly like, hey, like let's use the map this way. I have noticed a few members who have started asking to use it more. We have elections coming up for our steering committee, and somebody on the steering committee said, hey, Sarah, do you think we could run some social network analysis on our network map and see if any names pop up that we might want to recruit to run for the steering committee this year. I was like, oh, warms my heart that you even asked. Let's go check that out. So we'll do some things like that. And last year at the annual meeting planning committee, folks in the planning committee brought it up too. Like, hey, we don't know exactly what it is, but we know that network map's there. We think it's really cool, and we want to make sure it's showcased at the meeting. And, we'll bring together a planning team then to kind of figure that out. So it's slow going. I wish more people, wanted to go and use it for themselves. The reality is it's still very new, and I'm still kind of trying to help people really utilize it, I would say. Like I said, I'm kind of like the bridger here for the map.
But do you find that even still, even though it's like largely in your wheelhouse to use it, that it's been a useful tool for strategically thinking about how to connect folks in your network and how to develop your network?
Yes. Yeah, like besides the story I shared about individuals can kind of come and we can ask some of those questions and find people. One year at an annual meeting, we actually used the map to do intentional matchmaking. So we just kind of used a bunch of criteria and looked at the relationships and information I knew about people too. And it was like, okay, I know you're already leading this action team and they aren't doing a very good job of really thinking about how they're folding equity into their work. And I know that this person over here is doing similar work. They are actually doing a great job on equity. I'm going to intentionally match these people together because I know there's something for them to learn from one another. So we have used it in that way to we said we put a name on the back of their tag at the annual meeting. We're like, okay, your job is at this meeting is to find this person and get to know them. And when you do, you're going to find out why we told you to do that. So we've done some fun things like that with it too. We've also used it to kind of almost ground truth what we believe the network is doing, right? We talk about relationships being the foundation for everything that we do together and the importance of building trust. How do you write that in a grant report? How do you prove that, right? How do I tell the funder, no, really, I swear, we really created this many more relationships and deepen trust in this way? That's a really hard thing to answer. But with the map, we actually have some data to support the fact that we're either increasing connections or deepening the strength of those connections over time. So it actually kind of helps us ground truth some of those things. We've also used it kind of check in on some key questions. We had a theory that if you were involved in a state table, that you were going to be more connected to the network than somebody who wasn't. And so we'd actually worked with the founders for Greater Than the Sum to kind of dive into our data and see if we could answer that question. So we've kind of used it a lot in that way too, I would say, to kind of back up our claims of what we believe to be true, or kind of checking in, is what we believe happening actually happening?
Thanks, Sarah.
Casey had to hop, but she said she really
Yep.
enjoyed this and wanted to express her appreciation to you.
Perfect. Well, I'm excited for the next time though too, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of REAM's genesis from that 2016, 2017 time till now. So I'll be talking a lot more about our journey to really embed equity into our work. Share a lot more of some of the tools, the practices, the ways that we're learning, how we gather feedback from the network that leads us to make decisions or change. So I'm going to do a little bit more of some of that discussion for our next time together.
Sarah, thank
And
you.
yes, the evaluation form. Thank you. Please fill out the evaluation form. I actually specifically asked for this because I was like, I want to make sure I know how this is landing for folks in case we need to do things differently next time. So please fill out your evaluation.
Yeah, and then
I was just gonna say I took a page from Sarah's creative evaluation playbook, which her evaluations always just make me laugh. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna channel Sarah when I make this evaluation. I think one of them was
I gotta look.
how did you feel about this session at your annual meeting? And one of the choices was it's like wordsmithing with a group of people, or it's like a 12-hour bus ride to North Dakota. It pulled in experiences from the network, in the answers of the evaluation that just made people chuckle. So any way we can get people to actually do those, I think is great. So thanks, Sarah, for inspiring kind of humor in everything we do.
You gotta have it. This work is hard, so, and it's hard working in a network. I know it's hard in terms of the organizational work that's happening. So, man, we just gotta have a little bit of humor about it just to get us through this, get us through the day.
I gotta say that one of the things that really struck me that I liked a lot that you shared, Sarah, was just the emphasis on sort of those campaigns in the beginning. And then
Mm-hmm.
the willingness that your network had to say, actually, this isn't the right approach. And we need to step back and spend more time on that relationship building and recognizing how even in some of the ways that you were identifying, I think it was your pri priorities, maybe that there needed to be more shared decision making in that process, and that there was sort of a power imbalance happening. And I just think those are probably pretty easy things to have happen just naturally as things evolve if you're not really careful. And I admire that you all took a step back and said, how can we structure this in a different way so that it's not so that we're kind of focusing more on the people and the trust and the shared emphasis. So thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. No, happy to share our story.
Thank you all for being here, and appreciate each and every one of you. Have a great day. And
Yeah, it was a pleasure meeting everybody. Look forward to seeing you all next time.
Yeah, and
Next month.
registration links for April 26th in there, and we hope to see you then.
Thanks all.
Have a great day.